Well, Peter, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm going to have to shorten my bio sketch so that it's more tenable. I was asked to talk about what's new in lipid-lowering therapy, and there's been a lot of activity over this in the last year or so. And so the title of my talk is, Where Will the New Targets End Up? Is Lower Actually Better? So my disclosures are I do research in clinical trials related to lipid-lowering medications, and I've been the co-chair of the CCS dyslipidemia guidelines for the last 5 or so years. So I have some bias with respect to that process. So how I'm going to start is I'm going to tell you what the current guidelines have said. We released the guidelines about a year ago, and these are published in the Canadian Journal. And then I will walk you through the new evidence since that time, which really talks about maybe we are not quite there in terms of what the right value will be. So when we think about lipid-lowering therapy, is that what we want to do is quantify risk and decide which patients would gain benefit from being on medications. And the starting medications are really statins. Statins are the most widely prescribed drugs in history from a pharmaceutical point of view. So what we did is we divided into 2 groups of patients. The first group are what we call statin-indicated conditions. If the individual has these conditions, regardless of what their cholesterol is that you should have a conversation with the patient about statins. And that includes clinical atherosclerosis, coronary, cerebrovascular or peripheral vascular disease, abdominal aortic aneurysm, defined as more than 3 centimeters. Most people with diabetes, and in small print there you can see individuals with diabetes over the age of 40 or with more than 15 years duration of type 1 diabetes or microvascular complications. So most people with diabetes. Chronic kidney disease now includes everybody with a GFR that's low or anybody with proteinuria. This is a high-risk condition equivalent to diabetes. And then there are those that have a genetic dyslipidemia probability if the LDL cholesterol is more than 5 millimoles. So if you have an LDL cholesterol more than 5, which is about 5% of the population, those individuals should be on statin therapy even if they're low risk. The next group fits into those that don't have any of those factors and what we call primary prevention. And if you're in a primary prevention cohort, then what you need to do is some kind of risk evaluation excuse me, for that patient. If you do a Framingham risk score, which is generally what we tend to recommend, and you can go to the internet and type that in and you put in their variables. If they're high risk, which means a 10-year risk more than 20%, they should probably be treated. If they're intermediate risk, a risk between 10 and 19%, and that's a lot of us in the room here, then those individuals don't all need therapy, but what we've said is that if their LDL cholesterol is more than 3.5 millimoles per liter, or if they have conditions that would have gotten them into the HOPE-3 study. So in your world, is that a man over 50 or a woman over 60 with one risk factor, and that could be hypertension, those individuals should probably be on therapy. And then the low-risk individuals, not so much. And what we've targeted thus far is that you identify those people, you would start them on a statin therapy, and what you're trying to achieve is an LDL cholesterol less than 2, or a 50% reduction from where they started from. If you have a high LDL cholesterol in primary prevention, i.e. your LDL starts at 5 or more, we didn't want to say that you needed to get to less than 2 because that would involve 2 medications for most people. Okay, so these are the guidelines. These are fairly conservative. This follows what a lot of the national guidelines have recommended over the years. Guidelines are guidelines. This is a primary panel that included about 22 individuals, endocrinologists, cardiologists, primary care, nursing, etc. And it's really the compilation of all of those thoughts and biases and processes. So that's where we're at. That's the Canadian compromise. And some say we're not being aggressive enough. So let me make the case over the next 10 minutes or so that maybe lower is better. And at the outset, the first thing we need to know is that unlike hypertension or unlike diabetes, we do not have a randomized trial where individuals were randomized to a certain set LDL level, i.e. an LDL less than 2 or less than 1.5 or less than 1.0. So we have no randomized trial to help us. We don't have a hot study equivalent in this field. But the evidence I'm going to show you here makes a circumstantial case that maybe that's the case. The first thing is biological plausibility, and I won't talk more about that. Basically is that ApoB containing lipoproteins and that include LDL are very much linked to atherogenesis. If you have an animal model and you don't have cholesterol in it, they don't get atherosclerosis. If you have a human population whose LDL is really low, Neanderthal man way back when, subsistence farming in China where the LDL is super low, they just don't get coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease is a symptom of excess of intake over the last 100 or more years. We're going to talk a little bit about these other things, Mendelian randomization, some of the statin trials, and then I'm going to show you a couple of new trials that have been published in the last year that would suggest our target of 2 millimoles per liter maybe is something that we could talk about. Okay, so here's the first question. Hands up, who's heard of the concept of Mendelian randomization? Okay, so Mendelian randomization gets to the epidemiology related to your personal genetics. There are lots of genes that control what your LDL cholesterol is. The mean LDL cholesterol in the population is around 3.5, but there is individuals whose LDL is less than 1. I happen to have good Swedish genetics, so my LDL is 0.9, not because of anything that I do, just because I probably have a good collection of genes. There's other individuals whose LDL is 4.9. They don't do anything differently than me, but they have more bad LDL cholesterol genes. And if you look at that, and then look at the outcomes related to that compilation of genes, is what you can tell and see from this slide is that the y-axis is the proportion reduction in risk of coronary heart disease deaths related to the difference in your LDL cholesterol. So in the bottom red line, that's randomized controlled trials. If you lower LDL by 1 millimole per liter, you're 50 years of age, you go on to a trial, you lower your LDL by 1 with a statin, is you will have about a 20% reduction in cardiovascular events. If you happen to have a 1 millimole per liter reduction in your LDL based on your genetics, then you have about a 50% reduction in events because you were born with a lower LDL. During your formative years when you were a teenager, your LDL was lower and throughout your entire life. So it gets at longevity and also when the LDL was lower. So lowering LDL for 5 years when you're in your 50s with cardiovascular risk is a good thing, but being born with that combination of genes is even better. So for me, this argues that lower LDL, genetically induced, is a good thing and that risk is lower. Whether we can recapitulate that with therapy remains to be determined. The second point for lower is better relates to the relationship between cardiovascular events and LDL cholesterols in people who were in randomized trials. And this is a meta-analysis of about 38,000 patients. The turquoise line there looks at the hazard ratio for major cardiovascular events against the LDL level on therapy. So if your LDL is down there at the bottom left, 1.3 millimoles per liter or less, you can see that your event rate is lower than if it's 1.8 and lower than if it's 2.3 and lower than if it's 2.6. So does that mean lower is better? Well, maybe not. Maybe those individuals that got to an LDL of 1.3 on a statin, maybe they have other good features. Maybe they exercise more. Maybe their starting level was lower. Maybe they have some biological responsiveness to statins that's better. But that's what the epidemiology would suggest, and that gives us pause to think that maybe lower is better. Third point is that the reduction in LDL cholesterol in a randomized trial is also important. This is data from the Jupiter study. If you remember the Jupiter study from way back when, the Jupiter study was primary prevention, individuals with inflammation. This is Paul Ritker's study. If your CRP was more than 2, you were randomized to 20 milligrams of rosuvastatin or placebo. And what you see here is that you see the distribution of LDL lowering in individuals that received the drug. If you give somebody 20 milligrams of rosuvastatin, you expect their LDL is going to drop by about 50%, right? That's kind of what you expect in your clinical practice. But what you can see here is that on the far left, there is individuals who were taking the drug and their LDLs went up. Then there is a range of individuals whose LDLs dropped by 10%, 20%, 30%. And then you have the people on the right whose LDLs drop by 60 or 70%. So there's a spectrum, there's a heterogeneity of response. The median response is 50%. On the right side is what he showed, is that the more your LDL cholesterol dropped, the greater the percent reduction, the less events that you had. So those that are over on the far right that had a more than 50% reduction to 20 milligrams of rosuvastatin had an event rate that was much lower than those who didn't drop by that much. And there's several other studies that have shown that, and that's part of the reason that in the guidelines we say that a more than 50% reduction in LDL is what we're trying to achieve based on data like this. So again, does that mean that lower is better? Well, at least the percent reduction would tend to indicate that. The fourth bit of evidence results from the cholesterol treatment trialists. These are the meta-analysis of all the lipid studies, 100,000 or more patients that are put together, and they looked at the proportional effect on cardiovascular events for every 1 millimole you lower your cholesterol. And what you can see here is that more versus less, statin versus placebo, everything to the left of the line means that there is a greater reduction in events. And the composite of that is that a hazard ratio at the bottom of 0.78, which means that if you lower your LDL by 1 millimole, is that you will have a 22% reduction in events. And this is important when you start thinking about best bang for your buck for your patient. If you have a patient that's in front of you whose LDL cholesterol is 4, you give them a high-potency statin, you're going to drop their LDL by 50%. That's 2 millimoles per liter. You'll go from 4 to 2. Based on this is that their event reduction should be 22% times 2 millimoles, or about 44%. If you have somebody in front of you whose LDL is 2, and you give them a high-potency statin, they're only going to lower their LDL cholesterol by 1 millimole, and the relative risk reduction is going to be lower. So the benefit of any cholesterol therapy, just like any diabetes therapy or any hypertensive therapy, relates to what is their starting risk and how much benefit can you achieve. I think blood pressure would be the same. If you start with somebody whose blood pressure is 180 and lower it to 140, you're going to get better bang for your buck than taking somebody who's 125 and lowering them to 150. So this is the cholesterol treatment trialists. Okay, what about randomized clinical trials? So until about 2 or 3 years ago is that all we had was statin therapy. Statins worked great, lots of positive clinical trials, and then we went through this slump of a lot of negative trials. When we tried to add drugs onto statins to reduce events, they were all negative. Fibrates, niacin, ACAD inhibitors, CETP inhibitors. In the last couple of years, we've had several positive studies that I'll share. The first was related to the addition of ezetimibe in individuals with acute coronary syndromes. This is the Improve It study. This is individuals who had an acute coronary syndrome, received simvastatin. Their median LDL cholesterol was 1.8, and the other comparator group had ezetimibe 10 milligrams added to it. Their LDL cholesterol was 1.4, and the combination group had a statistically significant reduction in events. It was really small, but it was still important because it got to the concept that statins aren't the only drugs that decrease events. If you lower LDL by other means, then that's important. So we were really excited about that, not because we should put ezetimibe into the drinking water of everybody with an acute coronary syndrome, but because we were going to have new drugs coming out that would lower cholesterol more than the ezetimibe could. And the first of these trials was an intravascular ultrasound trial that I was involved with called GLAGOF. This now looks at the new class of medications called PCSK9 inhibitors. So hands up who's heard of these drugs? Okay, so these are monoclonal antibodies against PCSK9. If you block PCSK9, you will have more LDL receptors available to take cholesterol out of the system. They lower cholesterol, as you'll see in a couple of these trials, by about 60%. Doesn't matter if you're on statin or on placebo. So this was the GLAGOF trial, took about 1,000 patients in the cath lab who were having coronary angiography, did an intravascular ultrasound to look at how much plaque was in the artery, randomized them to placebo or one of the PCSK9 inhibitors, evolocumab, and then brought them back 18 months later and looked at how much plaque there was. So this was published in the fall. So there's the first, is that these individuals that were on statins, their LDL cholesterol was a little higher than you wanted at 2.4, but those that received the PCSK9 inhibitor had a 60% reduction in their LDL, and now their LDLs dropped to really low levels, 0.9, the lowest LDL we've seen in any sort of clinical trial. And what happened there is that those individuals that were in the placebo group had no progression of plaque or no regression of plaque, but those that were in the combination group with the really low LDL now had significant regression of atherosclerosis. We think regression of atherosclerosis is a good surrogate of what's going to happen in clinical trials, but it is not a clinical trial looking at hard cardiovascular endpoints. But it was interesting for the pathophysiology. At the same time, we knew that there were large randomized trials going on with PCSK9 inhibitors, and I'm going to talk to you about the first one. That's Fourier. That study was released earlier in the spring. The Odyssey Outcomes trial with alirocumab, an equally efficient PCSK9 inhibitor for lowering cholesterol, will be out in the next 18 months or so. Unfortunately, the compound on the right, the SPIRE trials with bosacizumab, that program was discontinued about 6 months ago because those drugs developed antibodies against the drug that we were giving, and there was an attenuation of the effect. So Fourier came out at the ACC, so very similarly to the IVUS study, is that now we have individuals on placebo whose LDL was about 2.4, and now we had another 60% reduction. And so in the active combination group is we now had achieved LDL cholesterol levels of 0.8, okay? 0.8 millimoles per liter. I told you at the beginning that our current guidelines say people with coronary disease should get down to less than 2. Now we have individuals that got into this trial if their LDL was more than 1.8 and now have super low levels. So what did that translate into? Study was short-acting. Most of the previous statin trials were 5 years or longer. This study was stopped after 2.2 years for benefit, and what you can see there is a hazard ratio of 0.85 for the primary endpoint of cardiovascular death, stroke, or myocardial infarction, and so an absolute 2% reduction in events. So stopped very early. Would have been nice if it had gone on a little longer, but highly statistically significant. A follow-up paper that was published just about 6 weeks ago said, okay, so what does this look like with respect to how low you got your LDL cholesterol? In the red, those are the people that were on the combination, including the PCSK9 inhibitors, and that's the histogram of their cholesterols. And you can see there is that the vast majority, more than 60% of the individuals had an LDL now less than 1 millimole per liter. The blue are those individuals that were on placebo, and it was shifted over. When they then looked at what the event rates were based on LDL, you can see a continuous relationship. There doesn't seem to be a lower limit where you're going to get benefit. So you can see there's a little bit of a plateau around 2 millimoles per liter, but then it's a gradual fall in event rates all the way down to LDL levels of 0.3. 0.3 millimoles per liter, very low levels, levels that would make some of you in the room nervous, would make some of our referring colleagues nervous. I get phone calls all the time, patients on this drug or that drug, their LDL's less than 1. I back titrated the medication. The other thing that this study showed was that this was absolutely safe to do. There is no downside risk of having very low LDL levels. So that's the new data that we've seen here, really just published over the last 6 months or so, that would maybe suggest that our current guidelines are pretty conservative. This is another drug. This is a CETP inhibitor called anacetrapib. This study was released at the European Society of Cardiology meetings as well, and again showed that in those individuals with a statin plus this drug that lowered LDL to 0.9 is that there was a small but statistically significant reduction in events. So lots of drugs now we have available that show benefit. Some don't, but ezetimibe, anacetrapib, and the PCSK9 inhibitors on top of statins. So we now have the ability to get to very low levels of LDL cholesterol. The current guidelines, this was published a year ago and basically are still probably fine. You can look at the different indicated conditions. If they have an indication for treatment, you start a statin. If you don't get to whatever your target is, less than 2 millimoles per liter or a 50% reduction, you make sure that they're taking the drug. You have that conversation, that shared decision making. It's interesting is that you would just assume everybody with coronary disease is taking a statin, but the reality is about a quarter of patients at the highest risk don't take the drug at all, and 60% of people aren't at even a very conservative goal. So we have a lot of room to move on the lipid side. Similar to where you were at with hypertension 20 years ago, hypertension control and detection is now very, very good. If you still think that you want to go lower, you can add new drugs, including ezetimibe or the PCSK9 inhibitors. So you'd say, well, that's great. We have a new drug. We can start doling it out. The problem with the PCSK9 inhibitors, as a lot of you know, is that they're not inexpensive medications. The monoclonal antibody part of it where you have to inject, that doesn't really seem to phase patients very much. Patients inject insulin, they inject GLP agonists, but the drugs are expensive. And so maybe our approach is going to be who's going to get the best bang for your buck. And this is a complicated slide, but basically what it gets at is the concept of benefit. Those individuals that will get the most benefit from these medications are those that have the very highest risk and the very highest cholesterol levels. So as an example, this just shows the number needed to treat for individuals that are already on a statin. So if you're super high risk, CVD plus diabetes or chronic kidney disease, if your LDL cholesterol is around 160, which is 4 millimoles per liter, and you add ezetimibe, the number needed to treat to prevent one event is 38. If you get a 50% reduction in your LDL because of a PCSK9 inhibitor, the number needed to treat is much lower at 15, but the drugs are different in cost. And I think we're going to see a lot of this kind of analysis in terms of who we should be treating. All right, so in summary then is that we have guidelines that are available. Most people are comfortable with them. But emerging clinical trial data for efficacy and safety of combination therapies for those at higher risk now exists. Our current treatment targets are in line with other national guidelines, but I think you're going to start to see some downward movement. What the right value is, we can have some discussion in the question period, but I don't know what that's going to look like. We will probably update the guidelines in the next year or so, and obviously as these new medications have cost associated with them, some have very significant costs, is that the cost efficacy analysis will need to be done excuse me, for these combination therapies. So maybe I'll stop there and we can have some questions. Thank you.